In front of 17 million live viewers, Jasmine Crockett takes on Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox News judge turned federal nominee, over a past riddled with buried cases and political favors. Inside the Capitol, tension explodes as Crockett reveals a suppressed 2000 investigation, a leaked recording, and one damning testimony from Pirro's own aide. A motion is filed. Allies retreat. The hearing spirals into national crisis. But when Crockett drops her final line, the room freezes. Was this justice served, or the fall of a woman who thought she was untouchable? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol had seen its share of controversies, but nothing like this. When the president named Jeanine Pirro, the firebrand Fox News host turned judicial pundit, as interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, the move ignited a firestorm. Supporters painted her as a legal warrior, a woman who spoke hard truths and didn't flinch. They flooded the airwaves with clips of her pounding her desk on live TV, shouting about justice and loyalty. But to others, especially civil rights advocates and legal ethics boards, this wasn't bravery. It was recklessness. They warned of a politicized prosecutor with a history of blurring the line between courtroom and cable news. The past couldn't be ignored. Pirro once used her office to spy on her own husband, and her time on television was laced with partisan fire. Into this chaos stepped Congress, announcing a full-scale ethics hearing. This wasn't just vetting a nominee. It was a battle over whether the justice system could still be trusted. In the center of the storm stood Jasmine Crockett, a rising force on the House Judiciary Committee. She had become a lightning rod for those demanding accountability. While others hesitated, she spoke with fire. "Justice isn't a television show," she declared to a sea of flashing cameras, "and we won't let it be hijacked by someone who treats it like one." Her words cut through the static like a blade, and within hours, the press locked onto the clash. Crockett versus Pirro became a national headline, echoing across every network and newsfeed. In this hearing, the stakes weren't just legal, they were existential. One woman stood for order, the other for outrage. One believed justice was earned, the other had sold it for ratings. And as the doors to the hearing room opened, the air inside snapped with tension. Every light burned hot, every lens locked on. And at the center, two women prepared to face off, not just for position, but for the soul of the law itself. And then it happened, the quiet rupture before the storm. As the last whispers dissolved into static and the cameras adjusted for the moment they had waited hours to capture, the chamber doors opened with theatrical precision. What entered was not humility, not accountability, but control, wrapped in tailored confidence. Jeanine Pirro walked into the hearing room like she'd been here 1,000 times. Only this time, the courtroom was hers before she even sat down. Her stride was steady, surgically confident, heels slicing through silence as though each step erased the very notion that she could be questioned. She wore power like a costume, her blazer pressed so sharply it looked sculpted, her makeup flawless under the unforgiving floodlights, her eyes unblinking and predatory. She didn't look like a public servant. She looked like a performer stepping into a final act she'd already rehearsed. Her gaze swept across the committee dais, not with apprehension, but assessment, measuring who might bend, who might break, and who dared to challenge her. Then her eyes met Jasmine Crockett's, and for a beat, the entire room seemed to freeze in that invisible clash of legacies. The woman who had risen from civil rights battles now faced the woman who once shouted over legal nuance for television ratings. And in that moment, Pirro didn't blink. She smirked. She waited for the noise to return, for cameras to adjust their zoom, and when it did, she leaned into the microphone with the theatrical poise of someone who had mastered optics. "I have served justice my entire life," she said, her voice unwavering, rich with rehearsed conviction. "And no one has the authority to question my allegiance to the law." She didn't just say it. She carved it into the air, word by word, like the final line of a closing argument delivered to a jury she believed already belonged to her. The statement wasn't a defense, it was a dare, a warning to anyone in the room thinking of peeling back the curtain. It was the kind of line built not for truth, but for prime-time replay. For a second, there was only silence, not out of respect, but out of calculation. Because everyone in the room, including Jasmine Crockett, understood what had just happened. Jeanine Pirro hadn't walked in to be vetted. She had walked in to conquer. But as Jeanine Pirro's final words echoed through the chamber like a gavel in a hollow courtroom, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Because in her hands wasn't rhetoric, it was evidence. And truth doesn't ask for permission to speak. Jasmine Crockett moved with the kind of precision that silences even ambition. She didn't raise her voice or lean forward theatrically. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened a slim manila folder with the deliberate calm of a surgeon about to make the first incision. The rustling of paper sliced through the tension like a blade. "For the record," she began, her voice steady and sharp as polished steel, "this committee is tasked with evaluating not just the legal expertise of a nominee, but their ethical spine." She lifted a sheet of paper and held it just high enough for every camera in the room to capture its bold heading. United States versus Albert Pirro. Her tone never wavered. "This is the federal indictment of Albert Pirro, former husband of the nominee before us. 29 months in federal prison for conspiracy and tax evasion, totaling more than $1 million in fraud." Her eyes flicked to Jeanine just once, not in hostility, but in surgical focus. "And yet," she continued, "Ms. Pirro never once recused herself from prosecutorial decisions involving parties directly linked to his business or financial entanglements." The air in the hearing room grew colder, not figuratively, but palpably, like the oxygen itself had thickened into judgment. Staffers froze mid-note. Reporters stopped typing. The red recording lights on camera rigs glowed hotter now, tighter. One lens zoomed in so closely on Pirro's face you could see the faint twitch at the corner of her jaw. Gone was the practiced smile. Gone was the poised defiance. What remained was something far more human. Recognition. Because Crockett hadn't made a political statement. She had presented a pattern. "Ethics is not about what's illegal," Crockett said, voice unwavering. "It's about what's unacceptable." She placed the document flat on the desk with a finality that reverberated. "And I ask this body to consider whether someone who knowingly remained entangled in conflicts of interest, who never once stepped back even when justice demanded distance, should be trusted with the highest prosecutorial authority in our capital." For a moment, the silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was punitive. It was the sound of a mask cracking, and Jasmine Crockett hadn't even raised her voice. The weight of Crockett's accusation had just settled across the room like a thundercloud. But before the full force of it could crash down, Jeanine Pirro struck back with a tone of defiance that tried to reclaim control, unaware that Jasmine wasn't finished. She was only tightening the noose. "I cannot," Jeanine Pirro said, her voice crisp, her spine perfectly straight, "be judged for the mistakes of another person." She paused, carefully placing her palms on the table, as if anchoring herself physically before the waves rolled in. "I am not on trial for the sins of a former spouse. My ex-husband's legal troubles are his. I was not convicted. I was not charged. And I will not allow this committee to drag me through the mud for something I did not do." Her voice rose ever so slightly, not into a shout, but into a performance, tailored for the cameras now panning in tighter. It was the familiar rhythm of someone who had spent years commanding the attention of millions at 8 p.m. Controlled outrage, weaponized victimhood, calculated clarity. "I have served the public with integrity," she continued, "and no one has ever questioned my legal standing or my commitment to the law, until now, when it's politically convenient to do so." She was aiming for applause. What she got was a silence so taut it felt like glass waiting to shatter. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She let the words sit, heavy in the air, allowed them to echo off the marble and the congressional seal behind her. Then slowly she leaned forward, not with aggression, but precision. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was surgical. "You're absolutely right, Miss Pirro," she began. "You were not charged with your husband's crimes, but that's not what this committee is examining today. This hearing is not about guilt. It's about judgment." She flipped open the second folder on her desk. It was thicker than the last, more substantial. Inside, pages were flagged in yellow and red, with hand-scribbled notes in the margins. Crockett slid one of the pages out with the care of someone handling a live wire. We're here to determine whether a nominee for the highest prosecutorial position in this city understands and respects the ethical limits of power. Because while you weren't convicted of fraud, you did something that goes even deeper than legal wrongdoing. You blurred the line between personal revenge and public authority. Crockett raised the document slowly, turning it just enough so every camera and every eye in the room could see the heading. Internal Memo, Westchester County District Attorney's Office. Confidential. The date was June 14, 2006. Her voice sharpened like drawn steel. This is a directive, signed by one of your senior investigators. It orders surveillance, state-sanctioned surveillance, of your then-husband, Albert Pirro. Murmurs erupted instantly across the chamber. Staffers glanced at each other. Senators straightened in their chairs. Even seasoned aides in the back row leaned forward, suddenly alert. This surveillance wasn't initiated to protect the public, Crockett continued, eyes locked on Pirro now. It wasn't tied to a public safety threat, a terrorism lead, or even a white-collar crime case. It was, according to this memo, motivated by suspicions of infidelity and the potential for legal exposure that might embarrass your office. The blow didn't come like a thunderclap. It came like a slow, precise incision, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Pirro's jaw tightened. Her expression, moments ago defiant and composed, now shifted, just slightly but undeniably, into something colder, something calculated. Her lips parted as if to speak, but Crockett didn't stop. You weaponized your office to monitor your own husband, she said, her voice steady, not accusatory, but resolute. You used government resources, meant for the pursuit of justice, as a tool for personal gain. You weren't seeking to uphold the law. You were protecting your image. You were building a case against someone in your own household while wearing the seal of public trust. A reporter dropped their pen. The faint click echoed like a gunshot. In the gallery, a cameraman whispered, "She just buried her." But Crockett wasn't burying anyone. She was exposing something, rotted and real. She set the document down and tapped her finger gently against its corner, as if punctuating a sentence that would never leave the record. What matters to this committee, she said, her gaze unwavering, is not just whether a nominee has broken the law, but whether they've demonstrated a pattern of ethical disregard. Because the power you are now asking for, the authority to prosecute Americans in the capital of this nation, demands more than a resume. It demands restraint. And Ms. Pirro, based on your own actions, restraint is precisely what you lacked. She let the words hang like storm clouds over marble. Every sound in the room vanished. No rustling papers, no shifting chairs. Only the thrum of air conditioning and the sound of a nation watching through screens. Pirro didn't respond immediately. Her silence wasn't strength. It was calculation, damage control. But the damage was already done. Crockett had carved open the facade with documentation, testimony, and a truth too uncomfortable to spin. She didn't need volume. She didn't need fury. She had facts and the floor. And at that moment, the power Pirro once commanded on television meant nothing. Because here, in this hearing, the only thing louder than words was the sound of truth finding its voice. The silence in the chamber was deafening, but outside those grand oak doors, the impact was already spreading like a wildfire through Washington's concrete veins. Jasmine Crockett's precision didn't just pierce Jeanine Pirro's armor. It cracked the illusion entirely, and what came next wasn't a ripple. It was an institutional reckoning. It began with a letter, just one, signed by the Legal Ethics Consortium, a group of seasoned attorneys and judicial scholars known for their measured tone and reluctance to engage in political spectacle. But this wasn't careful diplomacy. This was a red alert. In bold font, it called for the immediate suspension of Jeanine Pirro's nomination, citing historical misconduct, demonstrated misuse of public office, and ethical negligence incompatible with federal prosecutorial duty. The letter was hand-delivered to every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee within 12 hours of the hearing. By dusk, 3 more watchdog groups had followed suit. The Government Accountability Forum submitted a 14-page complaint detailing years of Pirro's alleged ethical breaches, including her personal surveillance directive and her entanglements with right-wing advocacy donors during her time as a judge. They didn't ask questions. They drew conclusions. Ms. Pirro has shown a pattern of substituting personal agenda for impartial law enforcement, the letter stated bluntly. She is unfit for any role in the Justice Department, let alone its most public-facing district. What followed wasn't a political debate, it was a siege. National headlines turned, not gradually, but violently. Every major paper that had remained neutral suddenly found itself overtaken by a tide of public concern. The Washington Post ran an above-the-fold editorial titled, "Justice or Theater? Where does Jeanine Pirro belong?" But it was the New York Times that dropped the gauntlet. The editorial wasn't simply critical, it was surgical. Its headline alone sent tremors down K Street. Law in the hands of a talk show host? The piece began with a brutal first line. The United States Attorney's Office is not a segment of cable news, and Jeanine Pirro is not the custodian of impartial justice. It traced her entire trajectory, from bombastic monologues on Fox News to her history of wielding the law like a sword for political messaging. The editorial's tone was unflinching. To place Ms. Pirro in charge of the most symbolically powerful prosecutorial office in America is not just reckless, it is dangerous. In a city where perception shapes reality, the damage was irreversible. Editorial boards across the country echoed the concern. The Chicago Tribune warned of a constitutional farce in the making. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution demanded immediate congressional reevaluation. And by nightfall, even conservative outlets began pulling back, hedging, hesitating, reframing. Inside the Republican Party, the division started quietly, with cold stares and nervous coffee briefings behind closed doors. But as the coverage widened and polling data began to trickle in, private discomfort turned into public fracture. The base was watching, yes, but so was the center, and the center was recoiling. One senior GOP strategist, speaking off the record to Politico, admitted the truth bluntly. We didn't expect Crockett to land a direct hit, but this isn't just a hit, it's a hemorrhage. Senator Roland Pike of Georgia, who just 3 days prior had declared Pirro a model of legal grit, reversed course with a 2-line press release. Given recent developments, I believe we must pause and reconsider. Ethics must always be our guiding principle. Within hours, others followed. Senator Alana Rhodes of Utah cited newly raised concerns and suspended her endorsement. Senator Wyatt Heller from Ohio withdrew support pending investigation. The Republican firewall, once impenetrable, had begun to erode in real time. And it wasn't erosion from outside. It was collapsing from within. The pressure didn't stop there. Committee aides were flooded with calls, emails, and public statements. Several state bar associations began reviewing Pirro's past conduct, prompted by citizen petitions that ballooned into the thousands overnight. Legal blogs dissected the internal memo Crockett exposed, with former prosecutors confirming that no district attorney should ever direct surveillance against a spouse without judicial oversight. It's a weaponization of the badge. On Capitol Hill, whispers intensified. Would the Judiciary Committee call for a pause? Would there be a secondary ethics review? Jasmine Crockett, for her part, said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't give victory interviews. She let the facts and the consequences do what they were always meant to do, stand on their own. And as staffers from both parties huddled in corners, reshuffling statements and recalculating press angles, it became clear that the narrative had shifted. No longer was this about whether Pirro was qualified. It was about whether a party, already fraying at the edges, could afford to stand behind a figure now dripping with controversy. And still, Pirro held her ground, on the surface. But those who watched her closely noticed the changes. Her once unbreakable smirk faltered during off-camera breaks. Her staff stopped handing out pre-written quotes, and her legal team, once confidently smiling from the gallery, began whispering with furrowed brows and folded notes. The walls were closing in, not from political theater, not from personal rivalry, but from the oldest force in democratic governance, accountability armed with evidence. And Jasmine Crockett? She remained in her chair, silent, composed, The folders closed in front of her. But the damage already written, already published, already irreversible. This wasn't scandal by hearsay. It was collapse by truth. And truth, when delivered with clarity and without compromise, has no expiration. The walls were already closing in, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't interested in just pressure. She wanted clarity. And sometimes clarity doesn't come from evidence or argument. Sometimes it comes from a voice that condemns itself. She stood with deliberate restraint, every movement choreographed not for drama, but for precision. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to grandstand. She was there to reveal, to strip away the layers of performance and pride that had protected Jeanine Pirro for decades. With a quiet nod to the committee clerk, she gestured to a compact speaker resting at the edge of the desk. Her tone never wavered. "I'd like to submit into the record an audio file," she said, her words crisp, controlled. It was captured during a closed-door ethics seminar held in February of 2022, where several former prosecutors were asked to reflect on the neutrality of law. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. A staffer tapped the play button, and for a beat there was only static. Then came the voice, clear, firm, unmistakably Pirro's. "I don't believe anyone can rule fairly without having a political worldview," the recording began. Her cadence was confident, matter-of-fact. "Justice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a tool, a weapon. Whether people admit it or not, if you don't walk into a courtroom with a side, you're already losing." There were no gasps this time, only stunned silence. The words didn't shout. They bled. One by one, heads turned toward Pirro at the witness table. She didn't move, but her knuckles tightened around the armrest of her chair. Her face, always prepared, always poised, began to harden at the edges, like porcelain under heat. Because this wasn't speculation. It wasn't media spin. It was her in her own voice, asserting that impartiality was a myth and that justice belonged to those who could bend it. Crockett waited, letting the silence breathe like oxygen before striking the match. "What you just heard," she said, her voice low but resonant, "is not a mistake. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a belief, a doctrine, held by the very woman now asking to wield prosecutorial authority over the capital of the United States." She stepped forward, not pacing, but planting each word into the chamber like a flag. "This isn't about a policy disagreement. This is about the soul of justice itself, about whether we, as a nation, still believe that the law should stand above politics or be consumed by it." Her eyes swept the panel. Some looked down. Others locked eyes, unable to look away. Because if we confirm someone who openly believes justice must be guided by partisanship, then we are no longer defending the Constitution. We are rewriting it. She turned, this time speaking not just to the committee, but to the cameras, to the country. "Let me say this plainly. Justice cannot wear red. It cannot wear blue. It must stand above, cold and clear, even when it makes us uncomfortable, even when it costs us politically. Because once we allow the gavel to be guided by ideology instead of law, we don't just lose cases, we lose the very idea of fairness." Her final words came not with fury, but with unmistakable finality. No one should sit in judgment over others while believing that the law is merely another tool in a political arsenal. That's not justice. That's tyranny in disguise. She stepped back, the audio now silent, the room breathless. And across the chamber, Jeanine Pirro sat still, no longer defiant, no longer smirking, just still. Because in that moment, her greatest weapon, her voice, had become her undoing. The sound of her own voice, cold, partisan, damning, still lingered in the air like smoke. And though the chamber remained silent, the balance had already shifted. Jeanine Pirro knew it. Everyone knew it. So she did what people do when truth begins to cut too close. She went personal. Her posture stiffened, chin raised just enough to feign control, but the tremble behind her voice betrayed what was really unraveling. Jeanine Pirro turned from defense to offense, her tone laced with venom masked as authority. "Let's not pretend, Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her words slicing into the still air. "You speak as if you've carried the burden of the bench, as if you've shouldered the weight of a courtroom." Her eyes narrowed, daring Crockett to flinch. You haven't sat in judgment. You haven't ruled on evidence. You haven't made a decision with a man's future hanging in the balance. You're good with a microphone, I'll give you that. But microphones don't deliver justice. It was a swing aimed at Crockett's credibility, not her argument. A jab at experience, designed to distract from the bleeding wound Pirro couldn't stop. And yet, what was intended as dominance came out as desperation. The kind of desperation that echoes louder in silence than in rage. Jasmine Crockett didn't lean back. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply let the moment hang, heavy, blistering, undeniable. Then she stood, not for effect, not for show, but because some truths deserved to be spoken from a full height. Her voice when it came was quiet, but lethal. "You're right about one thing," she said, locking eyes with Pirro. "I haven't worn a robe. I haven't sat behind a bench with the weight of a gavel in my palm." She paused, not for dramatic tension, but for moral clarity. "Because I don't need robes to tell the truth. I don't need titles to know the difference between justice and power. I don't need a stage, a script, or a slogan to fight for the people who've never had a voice in the system." The chamber didn't move. The silence wasn't empty. It was electric. Then she delivered the line that would etch itself into the congressional record. "I don't need to read from a script to serve justice." The impact was instant, uncontainable. First a breathless beat, then a ripple of disbelief that turned into laughter. Not mocking, but stunned. It swept through the gallery like a gust through a dry canyon, followed by a burst of applause that broke protocol and shattered the last illusion of Pirro's composure. The cameras caught everything. Crockett's steel gaze, Pirro's faltering breath, the aides whispering behind cupped hands. The woman who had ruled television with an iron tongue now sat in a room where her power meant nothing. Her script was useless, and her legacy was under siege. Not by noise, but by poise. Crockett hadn't attacked. She had revealed. And in that room of judgment, Jeanine Pirro, for the first time in years, had nothing left to say. The laughter had faded, but what lingered was far more potent, a sense that beneath Jeanine Pirro's confidence lay a ledger of decisions not made, of justice denied. Jasmine Crockett knew that the real reckoning wouldn't come from a one-liner. It would come from peeling back the record, exposing the silences that had shielded power for far too long. Jasmine Crockett didn't waste time. She didn't need to. The moment had already turned, and now she leaned into the silence like a surgeon before an incision. "We've heard a lot today about experience," she said, her tone level but icy. "So let's talk about the record, not the one on camera, the one written in case files and delays and doors that never open." Her fingers moved methodically across a stack of folders labeled in red tabs, one for each instance, one for each omission. During Ms. Pirro's tenure as District Attorney of Westchester County, there were not one, not two, but 6 separate cases in which credible allegations were brought forward against sitting Republican officials. In each of those cases, charges were either deferred, declined, or allowed to languish until the statute of limitations expired. She lifted the first folder, opening it with the same restraint one might use to expose a long-buried wound. "Case file WDC 1174, she announced. "September 2000. The subject, State Senator Alan Riggs, accused of funneling over $300,000 in unreported campaign donations through shell nonprofits, several of which were later revealed to have direct financial overlap with PACs tied to Ms. Pirro's own political donors." She raised her eyes to meet the committee's. And what did the district attorney do? She delayed review, then quietly transferred the case to a subordinate office with no authority to prosecute. Her voice dropped a fraction. The case died. The money never returned. And Senator Riggs? He went on to host Ms. Pirro's re-election fundraiser the following spring. A low murmur passed through the chamber, this time not from the press gallery but from the lawmakers themselves. Crockett's next move was silent. She slid the next folder open, this one thicker, with a dozen exhibits clipped in place. Then there's case file WDC 1431. The subject, Mayor Charles Benton, accused of bribery, zoning fraud, and collusion with developers across 2 counties. Documents, whistleblower affidavits, were submitted directly to Ms. Pirro's office. Multiple, verified affidavits. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it deepened. Yet no charges were filed, not a single subpoena, no depositions. Why? Because Mayor Benton sat on the finance board of Westchester First, a private committee that bankrolled over $75,000 of advertising in support of Ms. Pirro's judicial campaign. Pirro said nothing. She didn't reach for her mic. Her hands had tightened visibly, thumbs pressing against each other in a nervous loop. The cameras caught every twitch, every hesitation. Crockett wasn't accusing without evidence. She was drawing blood from the record itself. The pattern is undeniable, Crockett said firmly. When the subject was powerful and conservative, Ms. Pirro's office looked the other way. When the paper trail led toward her own political infrastructure, justice didn't just slow down, it stopped entirely. She let her gaze sweep across the room, not with self-righteousness, but with controlled outrage. And that is not prosecutorial discretion. That is complicity cloaked in procedure. The silence was pierced by a voice not from the gallery, not from a reporter, but from within the committee itself. Representative Elias Crane, a centrist independent known for his reticence, cleared his throat and spoke with crisp resolve. "Madam Chair," he said, "given the weight of these disclosures in their apparent documentation, I move that this committee initiate an independent ethics review into Ms. Pirro's conduct during her tenure as district attorney. Until such a review is completed, I do not believe this nomination should proceed." A wave swept through the room, not applause, not outcry, but something colder, something final. Jasmine Crockett said nothing more. She closed the folder and slid it to the edge of her desk, the motion as exact and damning as any gavel strike. What she had laid bare wasn't a single scandal. It was a philosophy, a legacy of selective silence, designed to shield the powerful and punish only the convenient. And now, for the first time, it was no longer hidden behind robes, titles, or monologues. It was in the light, and it was unraveling. As Representative Crane's call for an ethics review echoed through the chamber, the moment shattered any illusion that this was just another confirmation hearing. Beyond the marble walls of Congress, a media storm had already been unleashed, and the country was watching every second like a nation holding its breath. Across America, television screens glowed with live feeds from Capitol Hill. CNN cut its usual afternoon programming to run a chyron in blood red. Pirro under fire, hearing spirals into historic showdown. MSNBC, which had been running a panel on international diplomacy, abruptly shifted to a split-screen broadcast of Jasmine Crockett calmly dismantling decades of silence with a voice as controlled as it was lethal. Even Fox News, once Pirro's home turf, aired the hearing live, though with a noticeably defensive tone, anchors speaking in clipped, uncomfortable phrases. The footage showed Crockett laying out one ethics violation after another with surgical clarity, while Pirro sat motionless, her eyes no longer scanning the room, her shoulders sinking minute by minute under the weight of credibility she could no longer hold. But what happened next shifted the storm into a supercell. On live television, in real time, a new voice emerged, not from the committee floor, but from the past. Benjamin Raskin, a former assistant district attorney who had served under Pirro in Westchester County for over 6 years, appeared unexpectedly on MSNBC's afternoon legal panel. What began as routine commentary turned into an unscheduled bombshell. "I've remained silent for a long time," Raskin began, his voice low but resolute. "But watching what Congresswoman Crockett revealed today, those case files, those patterns, that's not new to me. I saw it. I lived it." There was a moment of silence in the studio, the kind that precedes something seismic. I remember being told directly by senior staff, "That one's off limits. He's a friend of the office." That wasn't discretion. That was suppression. The panel froze. The host blinked, then nodded slowly. "So you're saying there were deliberate instructions not to prosecute certain individuals based on political ties?" Raskin nodded. "I'm saying the DA's office wasn't always working for the law. Sometimes it was working for Jeanine." The internet erupted. Hashtags like Washington Pirro cover-up, Nyach Crockett truth, and justice on trial trended worldwide within an hour. Legal TikTok exploded with former law clerks dissecting the body language of Pirro's silence, comparing her posture in real time with known courtroom tactics of defense under duress. Twitter turned into a war zone, half the country retweeting Crockett's now iconic line, "I don't need to read from a script to serve justice," the other half scrambling to deflect, distract, or deny. But the damage wasn't partisan anymore. It was structural. Because when a former ADA breaks ranks live, it opens a door no amount of messaging can close. As dusk settled over Washington, two more former prosecutors joined the fray. On CNN's The Situation Room, former Deputy ADA Lena Marshall, once heralded as Pirro's rising star, appeared via video call from her Manhattan office. She looked exhausted, but certain. "There were cases," she said, "where we were told to wait, not because of lack of evidence, but because the subject was politically inconvenient. I tried to push back once. Only once. After that, I was reassigned to juvenile misdemeanors." Her voice cracked slightly. "We had the power to hold people accountable, but power," she added, "is only dangerous when it stops being shared. And under Pirro, it stopped being shared a long time ago." The reactions in Washington were immediate and volatile. Senate staffers scrambled to draft new memos as phones rang nonstop inside committee offices. One Republican aide was overheard saying, "We're losing this. We're not just losing the nomination. We're losing the narrative." Meanwhile, Democratic leadership huddled behind closed doors, not in celebration, but in stunned acknowledgement that something larger than a single confirmation was happening. The hearing, meant to be routine, had become something else entirely, a televised courtroom of national conscience. Inside the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett remained silent through it all. She hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. She didn't need to. Every new revelation only amplified what she had already laid bare. She sat with quiet intensity, her hands folded, watching as the system began doing what it rarely does, correct itself in real time. A single screen in the chamber, usually reserved for visual exhibits, now displayed a live MSNBC banner. Breaking: multiple former prosecutors accuse Pirro of political interference. The room didn't cheer. It didn't clap. But something in the posture of the committee shifted, rigid lines softening, guarded eyes now wide open. Outside, protesters had gathered, some in support of Crockett, others stunned by the scale of what had been unearthed. Posters read, "No justice for sale," "The badge isn't a brand," and "Accountability has a name." Drone footage captured thousands outside the Capitol, footage that was replayed endlessly across primetime hours. And yet, in the heart of that storm, Jasmine remained steady. She wasn't reacting to the headlines. She had created them, not with sensationalism, but with precision, not with volume, but with verification. Back in the media centers, a quiet consensus began forming among analysts across the spectrum. One prominent legal commentator on Fox News, a longtime ally of Pirro, admitted on air, "This isn't a smear job. This is a well-documented dissection of her record, and frankly, it's one that leaves very little room for defense." The words "reluctant and grim" echoed through living rooms across the nation. Jeanine Pirro wasn't just in trouble, she was unraveling. And the walls weren't closing in because of a rival's ambition. They were closing in because of the truth. Unscripted, undeniable, unfolding live. As the hearing neared its final hour of coverage for the day, anchors across every network used the same word without prompting: historic. Not because of its scale, but because of its reversal. A former prosecutor turned pundit had entered the chamber expecting deference, and left exposed as a symbol of everything justice must not become. And it happened not through scandal, but through a calm, relentless dismantling by a woman who didn't shout, didn't insult, didn't gloat. She simply told the truth, one document at a time. And still, Jasmine Crockett hadn't said her last word. But America already understood the gravity of what she'd done. Because for the first time in years, truth didn't come from a news anchor. It came from a seat in Congress, in a voice that refused to be silenced. The media firestorm raged outside, and Pirro's silence inside the chamber grew heavier with every exposed detail. But Jasmine Crockett had saved one piece for last. Not a file, not a recording, but a man. And what he carried wasn't evidence. It was confession. The double doors at the rear of the hearing room opened without fanfare, but the energy in the chamber shifted instantly. In walked a man in his late 30s, dressed in a dark, rumpled suit that looked as if it had been agonized over before he stepped through that threshold. His hands clutched a simple folder, but it wasn't the paper he carried that made the room lean forward. It was the weight behind his steps. He moved slowly, deliberately, each stride toward the witness table echoing through the chamber like a countdown. Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The air itself held its breath. The nameplate slid into position. David Reardon, former legal aide to DA Jeanine Pirro. He sat down, placed the folder in front of him, and cleared his throat. The microphone caught the tremor. "Thank you, Madam Chair," he began, voice tight but composed. "My name is David Reardon. From 2001 to 2005, I served as a junior legal aide in the Westchester County District Attorney's Office under Ms. Jeanine Pirro." His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Pirro, who stared ahead as if he weren't there. "In late 2003, I was handed a preliminary case file involving alleged embezzlement and real estate fraud, file number WDC-3981. The subject of that file was a man named Richard Kalman." He paused. "Mr. Kalman was, and to my knowledge still is, a close personal friend of Ms. Pirro." A ripple passed through the room like a cold wind through glass. Reardon exhaled slowly. "When I brought the file to my supervisor, I was told, verbatim, that file's not going anywhere. Bury it. I asked if we were waiting for further documentation. I was told no. I asked if another office would be taking over. I was told no. I asked if Ms. Pirro had been briefed. I was told she already had been, and that she had personally ordered the file shelved." The words didn't explode. They sank, slow and suffocating. The committee didn't move. Neither did Pirro. But the truth was out, and now it had a name. Jasmine Crockett, who had remained still through the testimony, finally leaned forward. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Reardon, are you prepared to submit that statement under penalty of perjury?" Reardon nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I am." She glanced briefly at the folder. "And the notes you brought today, are those your own documentation from that time?" "They are," he said. "Contemporaneous, dated, and notarized. I didn't come forward before because I didn't think it would matter. But what I saw in this hearing, what I saw you do with truth, I realized it was time." There was no applause, no exhale, just tension so thick it seemed to weigh on every shoulder in the room. Crockett gave a small nod, measured, controlled. "Thank you, Mr. Reardon," she said. Her eyes were steady, but her voice carried a subtle finality. "Thank you for choosing truth." It was more than gratitude, it was recognition, a line drawn between those who protect the system and those who protect themselves. The cameras caught it all, Reardon's steady breath, Crockett's gaze, and Pirro's stillness, now edged with something that looked almost like dread. The room sat in stunned stillness for several seconds longer than protocol would allow. Reardon lowered his eyes. The folder remained on the desk, untouched, glowing like radioactive material. What it contained didn't need to be read aloud. Its existence was enough. In that moment, Jeanine Pirro wasn't just a nominee under scrutiny. She was the subject of testimony, real, personal, damning, and there was no segment, no soundbite, no studio lighting that could reframe it. The truth had spoken. And this time, it wasn't coming from her lips. It was coming from someone who had once been told to stay silent and finally refused. Jasmine Crockett remained composed, but behind her stillness was a pulse that matched the nation's own. A collective realization that what had once been locked in sealed folders was now public record, and what had once been a name protected by prestige had now become a symbol of why the system must answer to those it was designed to serve. Not the powerful, not the connected, but the people. And at that table, for the first time in a long time, one of those people had chosen to speak. The confession had landed like a hammer, and as the silence deepened, it became clear this hearing was no longer about persuasion. It was about consequence. And when institutions are cornered by truth, their response is rarely quiet. It started with whispers in the corners of the chamber, Staffers darting between seats, black folders handed off like relay batons, committee chairs leaning into hushed conversations behind tightly gripped microphones. Then the gavel fell again, not from the chairwoman, but from protocol. A special subcommittee, hastily formed under emergency ethics procedures, motioned to address the room. The lead, Representative Alice Monroe of Colorado, known for her judicial neutrality, rose to speak. Her voice, though calm, sliced through the chamber like steel. Given the gravity of the testimony presented today, the substantiated allegations of ethical misconduct and corroborated evidence of interference and selective prosecution, this body cannot, in good conscience, allow the nominee to proceed in an acting capacity while questions of legality and impartiality remain unresolved. The words were precise. They weren't inflammatory, they were surgical. Monroe continued, therefore, the Emergency Ethics Subcommittee recommends the immediate suspension of Ms. Jeanine Pirro's nomination and any acting prosecutorial authority, pending the completion of an independent investigation led by a neutral special counsel. Gasps broke out, not performative, not political, but real. This was no longer just a hearing. This was a reckoning with legal consequence. Monroe submitted the motion in writing. All eyes turned to the ranking members. The line had been drawn. It was now on record. At first, the GOP members froze, visibly calculating the fallout. But outside those chamber doors, reality was already raging. Polling data had begun shifting in real time. Editorial boards from swing states had issued statements within the hour. The conservative base was no longer enough to protect what now looked indefensible. And so, one by one, the firewall cracked. Representative Halderman of Texas, one of Pirro's earliest supporters, cleared his throat and leaned into the mic. In light of public interest and our duty to uphold institutional integrity, he said, eyes low, voice grudging, I support the subcommittee's recommendation. Others followed, not with passion, not with pride, but with the grim acceptance that no party survives when it's seen as shielding corruption in plain sight. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless, watching the shift unfold not with triumph, but with focus. This wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about the integrity of the office Pirro had sought to claim with showmanship and shadow. The camera zoomed in on the nominee, once a queen of broadcast thunder, now seated in near silence. Her shoulders tense, her breath shallow, her jaw clenched so tightly it seemed to shake beneath the skin. Still, she raised the mic. Her voice came clipped, sharp, not like someone defending their legacy, but like someone clawing to keep it. This is a political hunt, Pirro spat, the words brittle with indignation. This is retribution, not justice. A takedown scripted for the cameras and the headlines. I've spent my life fighting for the rule of law, only to be thrown to the wolves the moment my name no longer fits their agenda. She paused, looking around the room for affirmation. None came, not from her former supporters, not from the press, not even from the legal counsel seated quietly behind her. The moment was meant to reclaim her strength. It only revealed her isolation. For years, Pirro had controlled narratives with sound bites and spectacle. But here, under oath, under pressure, her story no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the record. And the record, now stained with testimony, documentation, and undeniable silence from her own allies, spoke louder than she ever could. The spotlight she once used to command had become a crucible, and no one was coming to pull her from the fire. The chamber remained still, but the tension screamed. There was no applause, no deflection, no rescue. Jeanine Pirro had declared herself hunted, but the truth, finally unburied and echoing through every corridor of Capitol Hill, had already pierced the armor. And this time, no headline could save her. The chamber had witnessed the fall of a giant, not through rage or vengeance, but through unwavering truth. And as the motion to suspend Pirro passed without objection, the room did not erupt, but it exhaled. In that breath, all eyes turned toward the woman who had made it possible. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, not as a victor, but as someone carrying the solemn weight of a moment far larger than herself. There was no fist raised, no smirk, no premature celebration. She simply gathered her folders, those now famous files that had unraveled a legacy, and straightened her blazer with the quiet resolve of someone who knew that justice, when it lands, doesn't roar. It lands like thunder in the bones. As she stepped back from the microphone, the room stirred. A single clap broke the silence. Then another, and another. Within seconds, a wave of applause swept across the hearing chamber, measured, restrained, but unmistakably reverent. Reporters stood. Staffers looked on, awestruck. Even members of the committee, long hardened by years of partisan crossfire, nodded silently as she passed. Crockett didn't pause to absorb it. She just kept walking. At the doorway, she turned once more, not to gloat, but to deliver what would become the closing line of a national reckoning. "The law," she said firmly, her voice amplified not by microphone, but by clarity, "is not a weapon for the powerful. It is where the powerless go to be heard." The silence that followed wasn't silence, it was tribute. Even Jeanine Pirro, still seated at the witness table, did not interrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She couldn't. That line, sharper than any cross-examination, more lasting than any headline, had already passed judgment. Not in rage, but in truth. Outside, the storm had broken. The Capitol steps, once empty, were now packed with onlookers, press crews, and citizen advocates who had been following the hearing minute by minute from the screens inside. As Crockett emerged through the towering doors of Congress, the sun broke momentarily through the clouds, casting a long, defined shadow at her feet. The cameras were already in position. ABC, CBS, MSNBC, and even Fox News, whose tone had shifted dramatically in the last 24 hours. They didn't shout questions. They didn't swarm. They simply followed her with lenses, as if trying to capture not a spectacle, but a shift in the atmosphere. The image was iconic. Jasmine Crockett descending the white stone steps, her face composed, the Capitol dome rising behind her like a monument to the very system she had dared to challenge from within. The sound that met her wasn't cheering. It was something quieter, but deeper. Respect, whispered thank yous from legal interns. A single man in a veteran's cap saluting from behind a barrier. Mothers holding their children a little higher so they could see. Signs that hadn't been raised in anger, but in faith. Justice is still possible. Truth needs no title. She spoke for us. No red carpets, no entourage. Just the steady echo of her heels against the marble, the flap of flags in the wind, and the hushed awe of a country that had watched one woman go to war with institutional silence and win. But behind the poise, behind the clarity, Crockett felt the weight of having been underestimated, scrutinized, dismissed, of walking into a room not as a celebrated figure, but as a disruption, and of knowing that everything she had faced, every sideways glance, every snide whisper, every veiled warning, had led to this moment. She hadn't just held the line. She had redrawn it, not with power, with principle. As she reached the last step, she stopped briefly, turned to face the crowd, and let the cameras capture her in full. There was no podium, no teleprompter, just a woman standing beneath the nation's most iconic symbol of law, having just reminded the country what that law was meant to serve. One final sentence left her lips, spoken not into microphones, but into history. Justice is not loud, it's not partisan, and it's not always easy to find. But when it shows up, when it finally speaks, it never whispers. Then she turned, descended into the sea of press, protest, and praise, and disappeared into the moment, not as a politician, but as a symbol, a guardian of truth in the middle of a political storm. And though the storm had not ended, something fundamental had changed. The people had seen the system confronted by its own reflection, and for once, it had blinked. The cameras faded, the crowd began to thin, and Jasmine Crockett disappeared into the shadows of the Capitol. Not for victory laps, not for glory. But in the stillness that followed, the question echoed louder than any applause. What does this all mean when the lights go off? What remained after the hearings, the headlines, and the unraveling of a legacy was not just a political moment, it was a human one. Jasmine Crockett had stood alone against a tide of institutional loyalty, media spectacle, and partisan inertia. She had walked into that chamber carrying nothing more than a stack of unshakable facts and the will to speak when silence was the easier road. And for that, she had been attacked, dismissed, and personally ridiculed by someone with decades of power, influence, and reputation. But she hadn't flinched. Because the truth is, the real cost of telling the truth isn't in the words, it's in the consequences, in the threats that come after, in the isolation when allies vanish, in the smear campaigns that begin the moment you stand for something larger than yourself. That's the price of integrity in public service. And she paid it every minute of that hearing, with dignity so still it silenced an empire. The lesson wasn't written in law books or constitutional clauses. It was written in Jasmine's restraint, her refusal to shout even when shouted at, her decision to stand still when baited to explode, her choice to lead not with volume, but with verification. In an era where public discourse is often won by whoever speaks loudest or hits hardest, she reminded the nation that courage isn't a punch, it's a presence, that justice isn't always dramatic, it's patient, that truth doesn't beg to be heard, it simply waits for someone brave enough to say it. And sometimes that someone is the one who walks into the room least expected to win. But perhaps the most powerful lesson was this: that the law, stripped of robes and titles, is only as strong as the people who defend its purpose. It is not made righteous by tradition. It is made righteous by those who refuse to let it be twisted by power. And on that day, Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge a nomination. She challenged the very idea that some people are too powerful to be held accountable. She proved that truth, when armed with discipline and moral clarity, can outlast arrogance, outmaneuver rhetoric, and outshine celebrity. And she did it not because it was easy, but because it was right. There was a moment, hours after the hearing, when Jasmine stood alone in her office. No cameras, no microphones, just the soft hum of a city still buzzing with the echoes of her words. She stared out at the Capitol dome glowing beneath the clouds, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't victory she felt. It wasn't vindication. It was something quieter, something harder, responsibility. Because once you tell the truth in a room built to deny it, you don't get to walk away clean. You carry that moment forward. You become the standard you set. And the next time the system tries to bury someone else, your silence becomes complicity. So you keep speaking. You keep standing, even when your voice trembles. Especially then, for those watching across the country, students, single mothers, veterans, public defenders, journalists, working-class Americans who had given up believing the law could still work for them, what they witnessed wasn't just a political showdown. It was a living example of what it looks like when someone dares to confront corruption without becoming consumed by it. They didn't see a politician, they saw a protector. And in a time where truth feels fragile and institutions feel hollow, that image, that steady voice calling the law back to its purpose, was not just rare, it was necessary. And so the story left behind isn't about Jeanine Pirro. It isn't about a fallen nomination or a crumbled reputation. It's about a deeper truth, that justice isn't reserved for the powerful, and it doesn't belong to those with the biggest platform. It belongs to those who defend it when no one else will. That's what Jasmine Crockett taught the country that day. That's what echoed long after the chamber emptied. And that's the lesson the nation can't afford to forget. But Jasmine Crockett didn't stand before that committee just to deliver a moment of moral clarity. She stood there to light a fuse. What followed wasn't a conclusion, it was a call. Because history has never been moved by silence. It's been rewritten by those who refuse to sit still in the face of injustice. Now is the time to decide what kind of country we want to be. Not tomorrow, not next election cycle, not when it's convenient or safe or profitable. Now, Jasmine Crockett's courage inside that hearing room was not a performance. It was a declaration that law must serve people, not power, that truth still matters, even when it's surrounded by decades of noise, that the system we've been told is too rigged, too corrupt, too entrenched to ever change can be cracked open when one person decides to stop asking for permission and starts demanding accountability. She didn't do it with wealth. She didn't do it with a machine behind her. She did it with a folder full of facts, a voice steady with principle, and the kind of discipline that doesn't chase applause, it chases impact. But if her courage stays confined to that hearing chamber, then the system wins again. If we watch the headlines fade and let the outrage drift into memory, then we've learned nothing. Because for every Jeanine Pirro exposed, there are 10 more hiding behind the same robes, the same networks, the same politics. Justice doesn't need another viral clip. It needs a citizenry that refuses to let corruption become normal. That doesn't just admire truth from afar, but defends it in every room where it's under siege. You don't have to be a congresswoman to do that. You don't have to be a lawyer or a politician or a TV personality. You just have to show up. Every single day in every way that matters. That means showing up in city halls where developers buy silence while displacing families. That means showing up in school board meetings where curricula are twisted to erase truth and replace it with comfort. That means showing up at the polls where voter suppression isn't a historical relic, it's an evolving strategy. That means showing up for whistleblowers who risk everything to tell the truth while the system tries to chew them up and spit them out. That means showing up for journalists who are targeted for asking the wrong questions, for community organizers who are surveilled, for public defenders drowning in caseloads because justice is rationed like privilege. Let Jasmine's actions remind you, integrity is not institutional, it's personal. It doesn't live in marble buildings, it lives in people. And it only survives if we keep breathing life into it, day after day, headline after headline, even when the spotlight moves on. Especially then, because the machinery of injustice counts on us forgetting. It counts on short attention spans. It counts on our exhaustion. It counts on cynicism. It counts on that moment when we say, well, that's just how politics works. But when we normalize corruption, we forfeit democracy. When we shrug at abuse of power, we invite it into our homes. When we stay silent in the face of suppression, we surrender the future. But here's the truth that scares the powerful the most. We are not powerless. Not when we organize, not when we vote, not when we call out judges, prosecutors, pundits, and lawmakers who hide behind title while selling out principle, not when we show up in numbers too large to ignore, not when we demand that justice be blind, not selectively deaf. Jasmine Crockett didn't just prove that speaking truth to power still matters. She reminded us that it's contagious, that when one voice cracks the silence, others follow, that when one person chooses courage over comfort, the entire foundation begins to shift. So let this moment be more than outrage. Let it be a spark. Let it be the day we stopped outsourcing our responsibility to fix what we already know is broken. Let it be the day we stopped waiting for someone else to clean up a mess we helped create by staying on the sidelines. Let it be the day we started treating democracy not as a spectator sport, but as a fight we have to re-enter over and over, even when we're tired, even when we're angry, even when it feels impossible. Because the truth is, the system will not save us. It never has. It was built to protect itself, to protect wealth, to protect power. It will write off every Jasmine Crockett as too emotional, too young, too inexperienced, too loud, too black, too bold, because it cannot afford to let someone like her redefine what justice looks like. But she already has. And now it's up to us to carry it forward. That means asking hard questions in quiet rooms. That means standing up for the employee who gets punished for telling the truth. That means calling out the judge whose conflicts of interest have gone unchecked. That means demanding transparency in local budgets. That means teaching our children that patriotism is not blind loyalty. It's courageous dissent. That means refusing to forget the names of the people steamrolled by silence. That means remembering that democracy is not guaranteed by documents. It's upheld by action. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.